At the end of the last episode, I told you something. That 4 miles from the burial mound at Sutton Hoo, 4 miles from the greatest royal grave ever found in Britain, stood the home of the king buried there. Historians had known this for over 1,000 years. Bede wrote it down. In 731 AD, he named the place. He described it as a vicus regius, a royal settlement, a seat of kings, and for 13 centuries after that, nobody could find it. The village of Rendlesham sits in the Suffolk countryside, 4 miles northeast of Sutton Hoo. Farmers have plowed its fields for generations. People have walked its lanes, attended its church, lived their lives on top of it, and beneath their feet, pressed into the same Suffolk soil that swallowed the king's bones at Sutton Hoo, lay the greatest Anglo-Saxon royal complex ever discovered in England. A great feasting hall, a pagan temple, a royal compound the size of 20 football pitches, built for a man who commanded the loyalty of every king south of the Humber, hidden in plain sight for over 1,000 years. And then in 2008, it started giving up its secrets. To understand why finding Rendlesham matters so much, you need to understand just how close we came to losing it forever. When Redwall died, around 625 AD, the world that produced him began to change. Within a generation, Christianity had swept through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The old pagan temples were demolished or converted. The royal dynasties that had built places like Rendlesham were absorbed, displaced, or simply forgotten. The Wofingas, the dynasty of the East Angles, the people Redwald ruled, faded from power over the following century. Their great hall at Rendlesham fell quiet. The timber rotted. The ditch silted up. The fields were plowed over, year after year, until nothing visible remained. But one man wrote it down. The Venerable Bede, a Northumbrian monk who never visited Rendlesham, never met any of its kings, but whose meticulous record-keeping in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, completed in 731 AD, became the single most important document for understanding early medieval England. In his history, Bede describes a king of the East Saxons, a man called Swithelm, being baptized into the Christian faith. And he notes, almost in passing, where this baptism took place. In a royal village called Rendlesham, the residence of Rendle in East Anglia. That's it. One sentence. A brief geographical note in the margins of a larger story, but that sentence survived. Through the Viking raids that destroyed the East Anglian monasteries, through the Norman conquest, through 1,000 years of plowing, building, and forgetting. And when modern archaeologists started asking the question, where exactly did the Sutton Hoo kings live? Bede's single sentence was the only real clue they had. Everyone knew roughly where to look. The village of Rendlesham was still there. The name had survived. What nobody could find was where exactly within that landscape the royal palace had stood. For decades, archaeologists searched. Field walking in the 1980s turned up fragments of 5th to 9th century pottery scattered through the fields north and west of the parish church. It suggested something was there. But there was nothing. No foundations, no crop marks, no obvious traces to suggest the kind of settlement Bede was describing. And the palace of the Sutton Hoo king seemed to have vanished as completely as the king himself. The breakthrough came not from a university excavation, not from a government survey, not from years of careful academic planning. It came from a phone call. In 2008, a local landowner in the Rendlesham area contacted Suffolk County Council's archaeological service. Someone had been illegally metal detecting on his field. He'd found things and taken them. The landowner was furious. He wanted it on record. The archaeologists who responded, led by Fay Minter of the Suffolk Archaeological Service, went to investigate. And when they looked at the field where the illegal detecting had happened, they found something that made them stop. The soil conditions here were unusual, the kind of soil that might preserve metal objects, and they decided to do a proper survey, a systematic one with responsible, licensed metal detector users, 4 of them, working methodically across the field. What they found over the next several years would change everything we thought we knew about Anglo-Saxon England. Over 5,000 objects, dating across all historical periods, but with an extraordinary concentration from the 5th to 8th centuries. Buckles, brooches, strap fittings, weights, coinage, object after object that whispered of wealth, of status, of power. This wasn't a random scatter of lost objects from a medieval village. This was the debris field of a royal center. When you use a high-status metal object at court, a decorated harness fitting, a garment clasp, a ceremonial weight, and you drop it, or it breaks, or it's discarded, it ends up in the ground near where you were using it. And over 200 years of royal occupation, that debris accumulates. The metal finds at Rendlesham were telling a story. Thousands of stories of people who ate from fine vessels, wore decorated clothing, traded Byzantine coins, and exercised power. And then the geophysics team arrived. Using magnetometry, equipment that measures tiny variations in the magnetic properties of the soil, they began scanning the ground without digging a single hole. And what appeared on their screens made the lead archaeologist catch her breath. There were buildings here. large ones. But it wasn't just the Great Hall. In the summer of 2023, 60 meters south of the hall, archaeologists found something that stopped the entire project in its tracks: a second building. Smaller than the hall, 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, but built with unusual solidity. The foundations were more robust than the size required. The walls had been constructed to support something taller than a normal building of those dimensions. No artifacts were found inside it, no domestic debris, no signs of cooking or sleeping or working. Its internal structure matched almost exactly the layout of buildings found at another early medieval royal site, Yeavering in Northumbria, that archaeologists have identified as a pre-Christian temple. And here is where the story circles back to something we encountered in the Sutton Hoo video. Remember what Bede said about Redwald? That he converted to Christianity, but then his wife and his advisors talked him out of it, and that rather than choosing between the old faith and the new, he built a temple containing 2 altars, one for Christ and one for the old gods. Bede describes this with barely concealed disgust. He calls it a corruption, an abomination. But now consider, the possible temple at Rendlesham sits 60 meters from the Great Hall of the East Anglian kings. Bede does not specifically say the 2-altar temple was at Rendlesham, but one of his contemporaries, King Ealdwulf, who ruled East Anglia from 664 to 713 AD, claimed he had seen the temple with his own eyes as a boy, which means it still existed intact in the mid-7th century at a royal site in East Anglia. Is this it? Is this the building where Redwald, the man most likely buried at Sutton Hoo, stood before the altar of Christ on one side and the altar of his ancestral gods on the other, trying to navigate between 2 worlds? We cannot be certain. Archaeology rarely gives us certainty. What it gives us is evidence, and the evidence at Rendlesham is more consistent with this identification than anything that's come before. The Wulfinga dynasty, Redwald's family, claimed descent from Woden, not just as a cultural metaphor, but as a literal genealogy. Their family tree, preserved in Anglo-Saxon chronicles, traces back through human kings to the god himself. To them, the pagan temple was not superstition. It was the house of their ancestor, and they built it 60 meters from where they ate, slept, held court, and governed an empire. Stand at Rendlesham and look southwest. 4 miles away, just visible on a clear day, is the slight rise in the ground where the Sutton Hoo burial mounds stand above the River Deben. This is not a coincidence of geography. This was a designed landscape. Archaeologists now believe that the Deben Valley was what they call a landscape of royal power, a deliberate arrangement of sites, each serving a different function in the life of the kingdom. Rendlesham was where the king lived, where he feasted his warriors, received tribute, administered justice, and prayed to both his gods. Sutton Hoo was where the kings were buried, where the dead were honored, where the dynasty announced its power to the world in the most extravagant terms imaginable. An 88-foot ship hauled uphill, loaded with the wealth of the known world, buried beneath a mound visible from the river. And the River Deben itself was the artery connecting it all, a navigable waterway that carried trade goods, diplomatic gifts, military forces, and the royal household as they moved through their territory. Some historians believe there was a processional route between the palace and the burial ground, a road, possibly the same road that runs through the Suffolk countryside today, slightly altered, slightly realigned, but fundamentally the same path that the living walked to bury their dead. When Redwald died, around 624 AD, the procession would have come from here, from this compound, down to the river, along the bank, to Sutton Hoo, and then they buried him in a ship, and they never told us his name. Rendlesham declined over the following century. The East Anglian kingdom lost power as the kingdom of Mercia rose to dominate central England. The great trading port of Ipswich, modern Ipswich, grew in importance, drawing wealth and activity away from the royal compound in the fields. By 720 AD or so, the Great Hall was no longer the seat of southern England's most powerful king. It was a memory, a place people passed through. The timbers rotted, the ditches filled, the fields were plowed, and after another 1,000 years, a farmer noticed someone metal detecting illegally on his land and made a phone call. What Rendlesham tells us, what it proves now that we can see it, is that the world of Sutton Hoo was not an isolated moment of brilliance. It was the product of a sophisticated, wealthy, connected royal center that had been building its power for over a century. A place with craftsmen, traders, diplomats, warriors, priests, and kings. A place that sat at the center of a landscape designed to project authority over the living and the dead alike. The man buried at Sutton Hoo didn't emerge from nowhere. He was born here. He grew up in this hall. He prayed in that temple to both his gods on both his altars. He walked down to the river and looked southwest toward the burial mounds of his ancestors. And when he died, his people carried him back that way. 1/3 of the Sutton Hoo site is still unexcavated. The Rendlesham compound extends beyond what has been surveyed. The Deben Valley holds more sites that have never been properly investigated. This story is not finished. It is barely begun.